Today is Wednesday, Vov Tevis, Tavshinai Gimel, and we are in Teres Menachem Sefer Mamar Vekibel Hayehudim Beis. Good morning. In the middle of the Mamar Vekibel Hayehudim Purim Tavshin Yud Aleph, and we are on page Lametes Ois Dalid, chapter 4. The Rebbe is basing his Maimer, his Chassidic discourse, on the previous Rebbe's Chassidic discourse, which begins with the pasuk from the Megillah, Vekibel Hayehudim, the Jews accepted upon themselves that which they began to do. And this is interpreted as meaning, in the inner meaning, that the Jews accepted on Purim that which they began to do at Matan Torah, which means to say that Purim represented the culmination of the giving of the Torah. Why is that? It would seem that the conditions that prevailed at Sinai were far more conducive to bringing the process of the giving of the Torah to its state of fullness, to its state of completeness, because the Jewish people then were at a much higher level spiritually, or rather the godliness that existed, the revelation of godliness that existed at the time of the giving of the Torah was much greater than the revelation of godliness at the time of the story of Purim. In fact, at the time of Purim, there was no revelation of godliness, or almost no revelation of godliness. Jewish people were challenged in their practice of Yiddishkeit, and so on and so forth. In addition to that, also, the physical state of the Jews at the time of Purim was dire. They were facing an existential threat. Whereas at Sinai, they were in the desert, all their needs were looked after, they were free people, nobody was persecuting them. So how is it, the previous Rebbe asks, that during Sinai, at Sinai, those conditions were not sufficient to bring Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, to its state of fullness and completeness, and we needed the rather negative and wanting conditions of Purim to bring Matan Torah to its state of shleimus, to its state of completeness. And the previous Rebbe explains that this is because of the Mesiras Nefesh. That during the time of Purim, Jews had complete self-sacrifice, notwithstanding the challenges that they faced. And this self-sacrifice was fueled and driven by Mordechai HaTzadik, who was the Moshe of that generation, particularly through the children. And the Rebbe asked a number of questions on this analysis of the previous Rebbe. A, why is it necessary to point out that the physical state of the Jews at the time of Purim was far worse, or almost the opposite of that which it was at the time of giving of the Torah? It would seem that concerning the matter that the previous Rebbe is trying to explain, it would be sufficient, or what's relevant is the spiritual state of the Jewish people. Why is it necessary to point out and to highlight the physical state? He also asked, why is it necessary, rather I'm saying it in reverse order. The second question I'm saying is actually the first question that I've asked. Why is it necessary to point out that their self-sacrifice was fueled and driven by Mordechai HaTzadik? It seems that what's important and relevant to the explanation is the fact that they had self-sacrifice. The fact that it was driven and led by Mordechai HaTzadik is true, it's a fact, but it seems not to be relevant. It would seem, on the superficial reading of it, that it would not be relevant, or rather, from the fact that the previous Rebbe mentions that it was driven and led by Mordechai HaTzadik through the children, this seems that it's relevant to the explanation that the previous Rebbe gives, and that's not immediately obvious, and we need to explain that. Besides these technical questions, the Rebbe also asks a more central question on the explanation itself. What's the explanation the previous Rebbe gives? Why did the process of Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, come to its state of fullness and completeness during Purim? Because during the time of Purim, Jews had self-sacrifice, which they did not, which, in other words, actual self-sacrifice. And they did not have that at the giving of the Torah. So the simple central question the Rebbe asks is, why is it necessary to have actual self-sacrifice in order to bring Matan Torah to the state of fullness and completeness? When the Jews accepted the Torah and they said Nasav and Ishma, they didn't make any conditions, and they said only if we don't have to have any self-sacrifice, but if we do, then we will not learn Nasav and learn Ishma. No. Nasav and Ishma means we will do what we will hear. We will do your bidding under all circumstances. The fact that they didn't have actual self-sacrifice at the time is because those conditions didn't prevail. It wasn't necessary. From Purim, it seems, or rather from the fact that we say that Purim brought Matan Torah to its state of fullness, it seems that actual self-sacrifice is vital in order to bring Matan Torah to its state of completeness. Without the Jewish people experiencing actual self-sacrifice, the giving of the Torah has not been completed. Why?
What examples are there of the Jews' self-sacrifice during Purim? They went to Haman's feast and they enjoyed themselves.
That was initially, but then when they were facing the
they fasted for 3 days.
When they
so where are the big examples of self-sacrifice?
There was a full year where the Jews were facing an existential threat, and all Jews remained steadfast and committed to their Yiddishkeit, notwithstanding the fact that they had an exit. Haman's decree was only on Jews. The Alter Rebbe says, had any Jew decided to leave Yiddishkeit, to leave Judaism, to convert, they would not be part of the decree. And nevertheless, nobody chose to do so. That's actual self-sacrifice. They knew that, of course, it was miraculous in the end that they prevailed, that the Jewish people prevailed at the time. But the way on the surface, they were in dire straits. They were, there was an existential threat. There was an actual decree to destroy the Jews. God forbid. So, and Rebbe says this is what was special about Purim, which brings Matan Torah to its state of fullness, to its state of completeness, without which it would be lacking. Then the Rebbe said, of course, we know that there is another Yom Tif, which we celebrate, where the Jews had self-sacrifice for Yiddishkeit, Chanukah. And nevertheless, it's specifically Purim, rather than Chanukah, that brings Matan Torah to its state of completeness. And that is not only because Purim chronologically happened before Chanukah. Purim happened at the tail end of Golus Bavel, right? Between the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash, the first temple and the second temple. The story of Chanukah happened basically smack in the middle of the second temple time, 212, 13, something like that. 213, 14 years into the second temple. The second temple stood for 420 years. So it was about 200 years after the story, more than 200 years after the story of Purim. The fact that the self-sacrifice of Purim is the one that brings Chanukah, brings Matan Torah to the state of fullness, is not only because chronologically it occurred earlier, but rather because the self-sacrifice that they had then is the type of self-sacrifice that's necessary to bring Matan Torah to the state of fullness and completeness. Because if it would not be that way, then we would have had to wait until Chanukah in order to bring Matan Torah to its state of fullness and completeness. That's the crux of what the Rebbe explained until now. Now, obviously, this all demands explanation. So we're up to chapter 4 on page Lamates. But in order to understand this, we need to preface Hayedua, that which is known, that the innovation that the giving of the Torah brought in relative to Torah and mitzvahs that existed before Matan Torah, the innovation is that the mitzvahs of our forefathers, and generally, the mitzvahs that existed before Matan Torah, Hoyerak Beruchnis, were only in the spiritual sense, in the spiritual realm. What the Rebbe is saying is this: in order to understand how Purim brings the process of Matan Torah to its state of completeness, to its state of fullness, we first have to understand what is Matan Torah. And the Rebbe actually in the footnote quotes from the Alter Rebbe and from the Mittel Rebbe that this is what they say. In order to understand the addition of Purim in the framework of Matan Torah, we first have to understand Matan Torah. Right? So by analyzing what Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, accomplished, we will then see what Purim contributed. Right? That's number one. Number two, mitzvahs existed before Matan Torah as well. There's a famous saying, a famous quote, Kimu ha'avis kol ha'Torah kula ad she'lo. Our forefathers fulfilled the entire Torah before it was given. Right? We also know when Yaakov Avinu ran away from Esav, he spent quite a number of years in the yeshiva of Shem and Ever. Right? So there was the study of Torah, and there was the fulfillment of mitzvahs before Matan Torah. So what did Matan Torah accomplish? What did Sinai accomplish? What was accomplished at Sinai? Before Sinai, before the Torah was given at Sinai, yes, there was fulfillment of mitzvahs, but it was in the spiritual sense, in the spiritual realm. What does that mean? Number one, there are a number of mitzvahs that could only be fulfilled in the spiritual sense. For example, take tefillin. There might have been physical acts before Matan Torah that were similar to the act of laying tefillin as we do today, but in what's inside the tefillin? Shema Yisrael, V'lahavta, B'hoyim Shemaya, right? But then there are also portions of the Torah that speak about our exodus of Egypt, our enslavement and exodus of Egypt. There was no Egypt, there was no enslavement yet. So how do they fulfill that aspect of the mitzvah before Matan Torah? Spiritually. Egypt and the exodus of Egypt physically is a representation of a spiritual dimension. That is Egypt, and a spiritual dimension that is the exit of Egypt, whatever that is in the celestial realms and levels, right? So how did they fulfill that aspect of the mitzvah? In the spiritual sense. How did our forefathers, before Matan Torah, fulfill that aspect of the mitzvah in the spiritual sense? That's number one. Number two, even those mitzvahs that they fulfilled physically, there's a difference between the fulfillment of a mitzvah before Matan Torah and the fulfillment of a mitzvah after Matan Torah, after the giving of the Torah. Before the giving of the Torah, the physical act, what happens when a Jew does a mitzvah, generally? One of the things that happens when a Jew does a mitzvah is he draws down holiness into the physical objects. Before Matan Torah, before the giving of the Torah, the drawing down of the holiness, the drawing down of the holiness is spiritually, not physically. There was no transformation. After Matan Torah, after the giving of the Torah, we transform the world. We transform the objects with which we perform the mitzvah. Right? And by the way, this works both ways. When we perform a mitzvah with an object, we draw holiness into the object. And if we perform an avera, a transgression, God forbid, with an object, we transform that negatively. That ability to transform was an innovation of Matan Torah. Before Matan Torah, that was not possible. Besides, of course, the mitzvah of Milah, which was unique, where God gave Abraham special instructions that he should perform the mitzvah. That was the one mitzvah which was transformative, as a preparation for Matan Torah, in fact. But generally speaking, the mitzvahs, the acts of the mitzvahs that the forefathers performed before Matan Torah were not transformative in that sense. Okay, so now let's see how the Rebbe spells this out. The neis of mitzvahs, in addition to the fact that there were a number of mitzvahs that our forefathers fulfilled only spiritually, and in the brackets, for example, the mitzvah of tefillin, in which the exodus of Egypt is mentioned. in the scrolls that are inside the boxes. And then, when the forefathers fulfilled the mitzvah of tefillin, the exile of Golos physically didn't exist yet. So how did they perform that? They performed that aspect of the mitzvah spiritually. So in addition to the fact that there were some mitzvahs that were performed spiritually, in addition to this, also the mitzvahs, which they actually fulfilled in the physical sense, the drawing down of the holiness into the object with which they performed the mitzvah was only spiritually. But not in the physical object with which they fulfilled the actual mitzvah. Why is this? Besides Bris Milah, of course. The only exception is Bris Milah of Avraham Avinu.
You said, but so they're doing it.
There were mitzvahs that fulfilled the Gashmis. For example, Avraham Avinu fulfilled the mitzvah of Achnas Sorchim. For example, the Zohar says that Yaakov Avinu, you know the story with the sheep and Lavan, and he put those sticks, those branches in front of them, and he carved out the bark with the different marks. The Zohar says that act was accomplished the same thing that we accomplish through putting on tefillin. The explanation is not important at the moment, but that was tefillin. Those sticks did not become holy objects. They remained, after he finished doing the mitzvah, they were sticks, just like any other, the ordinary sticks, just like any other. Right? So why is that? Why only after Matan Torah are we able to bring holiness, transform physical objects? And before Matan Torah we were not. Because before the giving of the Torah, there was a chasm between the upper realms and the lower realms. There was a decree. The upper realms should not descend to the lower, and the lower should not go up to the higher. Innately, the spiritual realms and the physical realms are two different worlds. Naturally, they're not fusible. And therefore, there wasn't the connection of the holiness of the mitzvah, which is the elyonim aspect. It's the upper realm aspect dimension. There was no connection between that with the physical object with which the mitzvah was done. So the spiritual aspect, the holiness of the mitzvah represents the elyonim, the upper realms. The physical act of the mitzvah represents the tachtonim, the lower realms. Before Matan Torah, there was a chasm. Not so concerning the fulfillment of mitzvahs. After the Torah was given, when the decree, when the chasm and the barrier between the upper and the lower was removed, then we are able to make the connection between the physical act, the physical object, with which we fulfill the mitzvah, im kedushas mitzvah, with the holiness of the mitzvah. Now we are able to fuse the upper and the lower realms to such an extent, to such an extent that concerning a number of mitzvahs, the physical object actually becomes an object of a mitzvah. For example, take tefillin, using the example of tefillin, the physical boxes with which we perform the mitzvah and the parchment on which we write the scrolls become holy objects. To such an extent that if it becomes puzzle, if they are no longer fit to be used as tefillin, you can't discard them. You have to not dispose of them, you have to bury them in a very specific way. There are degrees in this. Some things only become servants to the mitzvah but don't maintain the kedusha later on. But there are those things that are transformative. But generally speaking, the idea is that through Matan Torah, the ability to connect the spiritual and the physical, the holy and the physical, has become a reality, which didn't exist before Matan Torah. How is it possible to combine two things that are otherwise in two different worlds? How does that happen? If they are not fusible, what happened at Matan Torah? Okay, we say this happened at Matan Torah. What actually happened at Matan Torah that gave us the ability to combine two things that are otherwise not combinable? The answer is that at Matan Torah there was such a powerful revelation of godliness that it was beyond both the upper and the lower. If you have two opposing forces, that which could combine these two opposing forces is a force that's greater than the two. If you remember, we discussed also in one of the previous Shiurim, we say in davening, Oisa Shalom B'Mreimov, God makes peace on high. So our sages say, what does it mean he makes peace on high? Is there war on high? The answer is yes. There are two angels. One is called Gavriel, and one is called Michal and Gavriel. Michal is the host of water, Sar Shel Mayim. Gavriel, Sar Shel Eish. Gavriel is the host of fire. Fire and water, we know, are naturally opposing forces. God makes peace between Michal and Gavriel. They don't destroy, they don't extinguish one another. In other words, the fire doesn't consume. Michal doesn't consume Gavriel, and Gavriel doesn't consume Michal. Why? Because they both feel the force which is greater than both of them. What do they feel? They feel the presence of God. So therefore, what do they feel? They feel that they are representatives of Hashem. So in other words, their focus is not their particular character, their particular inyan, Michal water, and Gavriel fire, but rather what do they feel? We are both emissaries of Hashem. We're both here to do Hashem's bidding. Okay, I have to do it in the form of water. You have to do it in the form of fire. But that's just the detail. The reality, the overbearing reality, so far as they are concerned, is the fact that they are both malachim of Hashem, to fulfill God's will. In other words, there's a force that's greater than the two that unites them. Similarly, when it comes to fulfilling a mitzvah, where we can combine, after Matan Torah, where we combine the upper realms and the lower realms, the spiritual and the physical, that is because of what? Because of the unbelievably great revelation of godliness that came about at the giving of the Torah, which allows Ruchnis and Gashmis to be fused. That's what the Rebbe says here. The third line from the top. And based on that which is known, that the combination of two things that are opposites comes about through something which is greater than those two opposing forces. Move on, it's understood also in our case, that the combination of the upper realms and the lower realms, which came about as a result, or at the giving of the Torah at Sinai, that is because through the giving of the Torah, there was a drawing down of God's infinite light, which is beyond the categorizations of upper and lower, the higher realms and the lower realms. In other words, there was a revelation of godliness, of God's infinite light, which is greater than the upper and the lower. And therefore, that force gave us the ability to combine two opposites, Ruchnis and Gashmias. Omikol and move on, from all this is understood, that concerning the mitzvahs that we perform after the giving of the Torah, there are three aspects, three dimensions. Hatachten, there is the lower, which means what? The physical object with which we perform the mitzvah. Because even after Matan Torah, when the physical object with which we perform the mitzvah, nasa cheftzah shel mitzvah, becomes an object of a mitzvah, it hasn't been transformed into a spiritual object, into a spiritual being. The tefillin, even after we make them into tefillin, they don't become spiritual objects, they don't become angels, they don't lose their physical character, they remain physical objects. But in that physical object, we bring down kedusha. We fuse it with kedusha. So even after the giving of the Torah, even after Matan Torah, When we do have this transformative power, we are able to transform physical objects, but we don't actually change them into something spiritual. We make them holy, right? But we don't transform them into a spiritual object. They remain v'nisha davar gashmi. It remains a physical object. So in the mitzvah you have the tachten, the physical object. Then you have ha'elyon, the upper one, which is the kedusha. Because even after Matan Torah, when we fuse and we draw down the spiritual into the physical object, it still remains a spiritual. The holiness still remains spiritual. We don't take the holiness and turn it into physical. It's that the holiness and the spiritual fuses with the physical. So you still have the physical object. You still have the ruchnis, the spiritual aspect of it. So those are two things that you have. Then you have a bittul shel gidrei ha'elim v'tachten, and then you have the annulment of the characteristics of the upper and the lower. Why? Because the fact that the upper and the lower combine together, unite together, although they are naturally opposites, that's through the annulment of their characteristics. And how does that come about? Which comes about through the drawing down of God's infinite light, which is greater than the two.
That's what you're not able to achieve.
Varzu. Yes, that's what Yidden are able to achieve through the fulfillment of mitzvahs. So again, to sum up, the Rebbe says that after the giving of the Torah, a mitzvah consists of three aspects. There are three aspects in the fulfillment of a mitzvah, in what's brought about through the fulfillment of a mitzvah. Number one, you have that with which we perform the mitzvah, using again the example of tefillin. You have the physical tefillin, physical object. That is what we call tachton, the lower one, the gashmi, the physical. You have the holiness that we draw down into the tefillin. That is what's called the elyon, the upper one. Right? And even though we explained before that through the performance of a mitzvah, we transform, after Matan Torah, we're able to transform the physical into holiness. What does that mean, transform? It's not that it's magic. We take a physical object and it becomes spiritual. It remains a physical object. But it becomes a holy physical object. Right? But it remains physical. Similarly, the spiritual, when we draw down the spiritual into this physical world in a permanent way, which is what happens after Matan Torah, it's not that we take spirituality, godliness, and we transform it into physical. We fuse it with something physical. But that holiness and spirituality remains holiness and spirituality, fused with the physical. So we have the tachten, the object. Then we have the physical object. Then we have the elyon, the spiritual aspect of the mitzvah, the holiness, the godliness. And then we have the force that combines the two. Which is what? God's infinite light, which is greater than the physical and the spiritual, who has the power to combine them. That's point number one. Then the Rebbe is going to explain, this is in the actual mitzvah. Then the Rebbe is going to explain that these three dimensions also exist in the way we fulfill the mitzvah. And that we will learn, please God, tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem.